we're going to pick up really where that last panel left off by looking at the prospects for progress globally. And to do that, we have two people who have unique global perspectives on this particular topic, on many other topics as well. But to my immediate left, Darren Walker, who is president of the Ford Foundation, which has played a huge role in promoting LGBT rights, both in America and globally over the years. And to his left, Randy Berry, who is the US's special envoy on LGBT issues, working out of the State Department, and the first person to hold that role. I want to start actually with you, Randy. I mean, just give us the background. Why has that post been created? What's your job description? You know, how are you going to be judged?
Well, thank you for the question, and it's a pleasure to join you here today. My job description is pretty broad, and I have very few tools at my disposal. But just generally, the Secretary of State has asked me to structure up a presence, an entity, an initiative that helps us be more effective in terms of our global engagement, in terms of promoting a better understanding, a better environment on the basis of human rights for the members of this community. This is the culmination or the latest step in a move towards a greater focus in U.S. foreign policy that began back in 2011 with the presidential declaration and then with Secretary Clinton's initial direction while she was at the helm of the State Department. So over the years between 2011 and early last year, we had been gradually escalating the level of our engagement until the Secretary felt that the time was right to go ahead and move forward with the creation of the Special Envoy position. So in that role, I've been traveling extensively, 42 countries in the past 10 months, and engaging at consistently high levels within governments, working with civil society, working with foundational and business partners.
And is this a unique role that America has, or are other countries doing similar things with their...
It's unique as of now, but I would hope that is not the case for too long. It's a little lonely, but I believe that there is a discussion underway in a number of countries about the utility of this. I think we have to prove that it's a meaningful, helpful tool with which to advance our efforts. But I would hope we will see others join that.
Darren, I mean, you've been very active in this area for much of your career, but at Ford, you've really brought in a new agenda across the foundation, but including changing your policies on LGBT in a new strategy document you adopted recently. Part of that change is that you are de-emphasizing the role that Ford plays domestically in the US on LGBT issues and switching resources across to the global battle for progress. So can you just explain a bit the rationale for that?
Well, sure. First, I think the strategy document that you referred to puts inequality at the center of our work, because we believe that as a global foundation, the consistent theme we see around the world is growing inequality. And when you look at the LGBT community, particularly globally, one of the fundamental inequalities is simply the discourse around our issues, because the discourse is dominated by New York and Geneva and Stockholm for policies that reflect and actually are going to impact the lives of people in the global South. So for us, the fundamental thing we have to address is how do we ensure that as we sit in rooms like this and talk about what's needed in Africa and Latin America, that actually Africans are leading that discussion and that their voices are at the center of policy and at the design of programs and the implementation. So for us, one of the reasons we made the decision not to de-emphasize, but to, as we look at resources and choice making and our philanthropic dollars and how to get the best and highest impact on this issue, we determined that the best and highest use of our philanthropic dollars on LGBT rights issues is in the global South. And so we are working from our office in Johannesburg with a group of colleagues who are all in the global South, who are designing our strategy through a consultative process with leaders there. And that's new for us, because in the past, we, like most hegemonic American institutions, designed programs from New York to be implemented in Africa and Latin America and Asia. And we've turned that on its head.
But is there an implication there that you feel the battle's been largely won in the
Absolutely
United States?
not. I mean, you'd have to be under a rock to believe that the battle has been won in the United States. We have a hodgepodge of policies depending on what state you're in, what municipality you're in even. So the battle is far from over. But what we have seen here is such an accelerated, remarkable transformation in this country around this issue. And the fact that so many well-to-do LGBT people can now write checks comfortably to HRC, to all sorts of organizations, means that there's an opportunity to build a philanthropic agenda here that we don't have in places like Africa.
So you talk, as you look around the world in the global south, where do you see the areas where change is most possible fastest? I mean, is part of your agenda with this shift in resources to sort of make sure there's some toehold in the most extremely hostile countries, or are you going to focus more where it feels close to a changing point? Well,
one of the reasons our program is being led from our Johannesburg office is because in South Africa you have legislation that basically gives the right to marriage, that has completely decriminalized any and all LGBT activity. So there you have a country that still is struggling, as Randy knows very well, that is still struggling, even with all the laws. Is struggling culturally, because at the end of the day, one of the lessons that we've learned in the United States is the power of culture, the power of cultural narratives, which in fact drive inequality in the world. Cultural narratives that criminalize, that justify why certain people are at the margins in a society. Why in the United States are black men at the margins and in prisons more? They're cultural narratives that validate that. Why in India are Dalits on the street? They're cultural narratives that say they're supposed to be on the street, and that's okay. We've got to address the cultural narratives, and that's what we did in the United States, and that's the lesson for the global LGBT community.
And by that, and your experience in the United States in changing the cultural narrative, I mean, what sort of things do you have in mind?
Investing in media, investing in journalism, investing in people who are admired, people who are respected. Those were the early things that began to change the public's view. I mean, when you look back at any Gallup poll on the LGBT issues going back 10 or 15 years ago and look at polling today, it's remarkable. A big reason that happened was not because there were laws, but because there were people in our popular culture, people we admired. We loved Ellen. We just didn't know she was gay. But by the time we found out she was gay, I'm the straight guy in Kansas City, and I'm in love with Ellen. I think she's great. So there was a storyline there, a narrative over time, a cultural narrative that positioned her as a normal, admirable woman. And when she turned and said, I'm gay, what are you to do? You've fallen in love with Ellen. And so as you look across all of our culture in journalism, in media, in film, in documentaries, positioning our stories, our narratives to counter those cultural narratives that marginalize us has been a big part of why we've been successful in the U.S.
Now, Randy, we heard a bit earlier about Uganda from Jim Kim at the World Bank, and you've lived in Uganda, and that is often held up as one of the most unpleasant regimes with its attitudes to LGBT people. And I'm wondering, as you look at your diplomatic opportunity challenge, I mean, how much are you dividing your focus between trying to pull back the most extreme cases from, the worst sorts of laws, and how much your time is going on countries that are getting very close to maybe significant change, a liberalization of policy and so forth?
I generally break down my engagement in three broad categories, because obviously there's a deep need to engage in places like Uganda, in Kyrgyzstan, in other environments where we have a deep concern. We also, I think, have a responsibility to make sure we develop alliances here, because I think one thing that is clear to me as I've had a chance to travel is that I think the best chance for success is there when we have governments, when we have businesses, when we have all sorts of entities talking the same language of inclusiveness. And to do that, I think we need to work on those alliances. We do that by making sure that we are respectful of those countries. Frankly, the U.S. is a newcomer to this particular agenda. I think we need to respect the leadership that has been there for many years from our partners in Northern Europe, for example, but also to focus on, as Darren mentioned, what's going on in the global South, because there's I think, an emerging story that is pretty encouraging. That you just have to look at what's happening, in Chile, in Argentina, in Uruguay, in Brazil, in Colombia. What countries are leading the conversation on human rights? What countries are moving resolutions through the Human Rights Council? It's not the United States. We are there in support, and there's no reason for us to take over the leadership of that, because we have that Latin American group that is emerging in all sorts of fundamental ways. So I think those are the two margins. But where I think the greatest potential for success lies are that vast range of countries that reside somewhere in the middle. Because I think it's entirely possible to move the center of gravity through strategic engagement, through the right kind of approach that has to be country and culturally specific. That I think there's definitely not a one-size-all model that fits here. So I think we have to be smart and we have to be nimble in tailoring our engagement in each place.
Now, you see the positive story in Latin America. You haven't mentioned Asia, where I guess India and Indonesia are both sort of pretty worrying economies at the moment from an LGBT perspective.
Well, there are certainly some concerns there. In the previous panel, one of the panelists talked about some of the. I think it was Kenji that was talking about the environment in Singapore, which is a pretty difficult environment. I just returned from a trip to Asia a couple of weeks back, where again, we've seen a relatively troubling trend develop in the Indonesian public sphere, but I think that there is a counter narrative that's really interesting. Take a look at what's happening in Japan. Take a look at what's happening in Vietnam. Take a look at what's happening in Taiwan, where I think that is the story of the next 5 years in a global sense. That I think more and more we have in the bank leadership from the Americas and from Europe that is and Latin America specifically, I would note. But I think Asia is about to come on foot, and I think as we see these regional powers exercise more of a dedication on the issue of equality, that's going to be a great driver of change within the region. So
one of the arguments that defenders of anti-LGBT positions, particularly in the developing world, one of the arguments they tend to make is, this is all a sort of Western liberal agenda. It's the new colonialism, and governments, foundations, business are coming in and forcing us to do things that they're just not African, not Asian, or whatever. I mean, how do you respond to that argument, and how do you counter it?
Well, I think just simply being aware of it is an important first step, because I think we could, if we weren't careful in terms of shaping our narrative or engaging in the wrong sort of way, we could blunder in and actually cause unintentional harm when in fact we intend the opposite. I think a consultation with civil society leaders in every case is very important, and to make sure that we are supporting and not leading. That when I came onto my portfolio less than a year ago, I had a chance to meet with a Ugandan activist, a lesbian woman, incredibly creative, and we had a great meeting, and at the end of it I said, any advice that you'd have for me? And she said, yes, remember that you're not there to speak for us.
Right. I mean, I think one of the real challenges is that we aren't used to being humble, and
we being Americans?
We being Americans. No, we being American government, we being American foundations, that we actually approach the problem to listen. And I think it's very, very difficult, because we are wired to want to lead And we have learned the unintended consequences of leading from Washington on issues on the ground in Uganda. And I think what Randy's doing, and I think what the State Department is doing that is modeling for so many of us, is how do we, with some humility, approach solving this problem? And that is we've got to develop some new muscle to be able to do that effectively, because it's not a natural thing. And the other challenge is the sometimes tension between civil society in the United States on an issue and civil society in the South. Because civil society, what we often hear from civil society on the ground is, would you please tell those people back in New York and San Francisco to stop doing this, because it is harming us on the ground. And that discourse is really, really difficult to intermediate.
And one issue that I've written about is obviously this growing hostility in parts of the world where you have fairly autocratic regimes, typically unsympathetic to human rights and LGBT rights, to actually crack down on foreign charitable funding coming in, and Ford has been sort of caught up in that to some extent. I mean, how much does that limit what you can do and maybe increase the need for the business community to play a role, because there seems to be this different attitude taken by these governments to foreign businesses coming in and being active compared to the philanthropic charitable sector?
Well, I really do believe that the nonprofit, the civil society sector in much of the global South has taught us a lot about what we need to do to change. And the role of business is really critical. But we have to remember that this is a larger challenge around human rights broadly. So the LGBT issue is the tip of the spear of a much larger challenge that we're seeing with repressive regimes and free expression writ large. So it's not as if the LGBT issues are isolated and everything else is fine in the country. In many of these countries, we're also seeing crackdowns on civil society writ large. And so we've got to figure out how to align, and that's one of the things we're learning. But the role of business here is critical. I mean, I remember coming to New York as a young associate at a law firm, the reason I went to Cleary Gottlieb was because in the 1980s, before the city of New York had any policy on LGBT, there was a law firm that said, you can be gay and be a lawyer here and be happy. There's a huge role for business. And we just heard about what was happening in India. But there's a huge role for business. But even business has to carefully navigate and negotiate a very nuanced circumstance in a local country.
Mm-hmm. Randy, I was at the World Economic Forum in Davos in January, and Vice President Biden came along and spoke to business leaders and said, look, you guys can go much further in countries that are hostile to LGBT people in promoting LGBT rights than the US government is able to do. And and he offered, to support business in any way business wanted to be supported, as it took on that more of an active advocate role that he was urging them to take on. I mean, just talk us through, why he believes that, is that right, and what sort of support can the U.S. government give to the business community?
I think it's absolutely correct. One thing that I think is clear, because of some of the narratives that have developed on neo-imperialism, for example, or on Western values, is the diffusion of a broader conversation is very important. And I think there are a significant number of countries around the world where the conversation about inclusion as an economic development case, as a business model, will have much greater resonance. That you run afoul. I think this is why I was mentioning that I think it's very, very critical for us to engage in a nimble sort of way, so we know the language to use or the approach to take in a particular country. Now, I think the partnership between the U.S. government and business can be an interesting one. I believe that that having the conversation is important. Our interaction with a number of business associations or individual businesses, to make sure that we can lend our voice to where we see wonderful business practices developing, as was the case. There's been already a comment on our friends at IBM who've been doing some remarkable work around the world, but also in India recently, where just a couple of weeks ago they staged a significant event in southern India that I think is going to turn into something very, very productive. But I think that intersection is very, very important, that we simply engage in a conversation and are able to feature and to feature that kind of leadership, because the more diffuse that leadership is, the greater chance I think we have ultimately of success. We more formally at the State Department also maintain an alliance between foundations, businesses, and national governments through a structure called the Global Equality Fund, where businesses can actually even play a role in contributing money that then gets turned around and farmed out to civil society organizations around the world. So we're looking at various models of engagement, but the best practices one is, I believe, probably the most prominent.
And one of the things that's happening in business and certainly at large foundations is that the people who are representing our institutions represent the countries they're in. So you now, I mean, in the old days, you wouldn't have a Kenyan running the office of the Ford Foundation in Kenya. You would have someone from London or New York, running the office, because there was this model, this sort of what I find very patronizing, that this post-colonial model. Well, today we can't be effective. So Noha El Mikawi is running our office in Cairo because we believe that it will improve our likelihood for impact by having an Arab woman who knows the region, who is an authentic leader, and across the entire portfolio of offices. That's how we approach leadership. And in turn, our theory of change is that will accelerate the likelihood that we can make real change on the ground.
Well, I'm going to go over the questions in a moment, but that's the last question before we do that. I mean, Darren, you raised this earlier, but to what extent is pushing for LGBT inclusion, equality, part of a broader strategy around human rights, and to what extent should business be able to? Are you seeing sort of coalitions and partnerships that really do see this as a sort of broad brush strategy rather than just narrowly focusing in on one aspect of the strategy, which is LGBT?
Well, I mean, I think for us, because our mission is justice. So it's not justice for LGBT or justice, it's justice for all. And so we have to think about who's treated most unjustly, but we don't think about it in siloed ways as we might have in the past. And so it is part of a larger movement for justice where we hopefully can help to network different sectors in society who are advancing justice, something that we've seen in the US and has been, I think, relatively successful, although not as successful as it could have been in some ways because of our identity politics in the US. And I think, so we've got to see how all of this together fits into a human rights framework, and how all of it together fits into a justice framework. Resource that, invest in that, network that, create the platforms in country, in region, and globally to connect those people so they can have impact at various fora like the UN and other places.
And Randy, one last question for you. You're a career diplomat, not a political appointee, and I just wonder to what extent, we're all here in the US looking at this extraordinary election campaign and wondering what the hell is going on and just how much of tomorrow is going to be anything like today. And, is this an agenda that has any chance of surviving a change of party in government? I mean, is this sufficiently embedded in the State Department culture, in the foreign, in the Pentagon, in the CIA, and all these other organizations that we're hearing from today as well, that this is something that will have a life even if we have a very different president?
I was afraid you were going to ask that question. Look, I think what we're doing at the State Department is we are operating with an absolute presumption that we are on a trajectory that is not going to be interrupted. That I think ultimately, as you look at this, we have a very modest policy brief that we're working on that's focused on violence and discrimination. I think it's hard to find people who object to that framework. I have the opportunity through my work to brief our congressional leaders up on Capitol Hill on both sides of the aisle, and I find great receptivity connectivity and understanding on the basic agenda that we're working on. So I don't think I would have stepped into this territory if I didn't think it was a sustainable, achievable policy that we will continue our work on. So we're moving ahead full steam with an expectation that we're going to see these global alliances broaden and strengthen, regardless of who's the next president.
He's a great diplomat.
You're not so optimistic.
We understand why he's so successful. My gosh.
So let's throw it open to the comment at that point. Who'd like to go first with a question to one of these two gentlemen? There we are. Do say who you are, please.
Neil Grungras from Oram. Question to Randy. You've been extraordinary at carrying out exactly what you said, moving forward the agenda without having imperialistic overtones, because it's so important. A lot of the people here are probably concerned exactly with that. How do we frame our narrative in a way which will do good and not harm? Mm-hmm. Can you make any suggestions? Can you direct us to bodies that are thinking about this and helping to message this issue?
Yeah. One of the main inspirations for my manner of engagement is, we have a superb interaction with civil society groups both here in the United States, both individually and through the Council for Global Equality, but also we have this extraordinary network of civil society leaders from around the world. So it's rare that I set off on travel somewhere that I don't consult with leaders there, because I find there's a great deal of resourcefulness and creativity that's coming from civil society and also from our partners. My consultations also take place with business leaders. I think the key to success in engaging here in that way that does not unintentionally cause harm is for us to always be clear about our own path. That I think only through engaging in a transparent, honest sort of way can we be most effective. So, something that gets thrown at me quite frequently in foreign press, a little bit at home as well, isn't this hypocritical for the U.S. to engage as a foreign policy priority when we don't have our house in order at home? And I think it would only be fair criticism if we were somehow whitewashing that or not being honest about it. But I think, when we rock into town and say, do you want to talk about issues relating to, extreme evangelical presences that are advancing a cause that is very, very difficult? Well, we know a thing or two about that because that's a part of the rubric here. So I think just taking those lessons and engaging in an honest way to say we're not here with all the answers. What we're here to do is to engage in a conversation and to really look back to the welfare of civil society actors. So, I think the more structures that are taking up active conversations about this is great. I mean, you had mentioned the inclusion at the World Economic Forum. The World Bank has been providing substantial leadership. We've got now, I would say, an alliance of 20 or so national governments that are actively working in this space. Who will all gather, interestingly enough, in the Global South for the first time in July in Uruguay to have a discussion about the intersection between government and civil society. I see that great diffusion as one of leadership as one of my most hopeful aspects of the engagement. Thank you. Yeah.
Do you want to add anything to that, Darren?
No, I think he very well.
That's another question. Okay, at the back there.
It's a question for Randy.
Yeah, please say who you are as well.
Paul Wood from Bloomberg. Randy, I just wanted to give you the opportunity to plug a little bit about the Global Equality Fund and the success that has had in helping your work around the world and the partners that you've got with it. I don't know how many people are aware of it, but it's a great effort. Thank
you, Paul. I'm happy to do that. Back in 2011, the Global Equality Fund was established by an alliance of national governments to make sure that we were pooling our assets and working together to strengthen civil society around the world. Businesses and foundations have since joined that family. We now have nearly 25 members, and we're in accession talks with probably another 5 national governments and a number of businesses. But basically, the fund operates by collecting resources into a single pool and sitting as a multi-sectoral decision-making entity. So governments, businesses, and foundations sit together to review review projects, to review political situations, and we make our funding decisions together. I think that's a tremendous model of public-private partnership. I can also tell you that fund, in the life of its existence, has farmed out a little in excess of $20 million in support to civil society organizations in 50 countries, and that is a drop in the bucket. That there is a huge unmet need there, and we hear it every time I travel about the need to resource more effectively. So we talk about the Global Equality Fund as a great mechanism where businesses can be involved, and not just in terms of writing a check, but in terms of sitting with us together to decide where that funding should be allocated.
But don't diminish your impact, because a $50,000 grant in a place like Uganda, I mean, we again have our American sort of perspective where most NGOs throw a rock at you if you offer them $50,000. I mean, in many places, a $50,000 grant is serious money.
Absolutely, that's a great point. What I see is the number of $20,000 or $25,000 grants that we can't even meet is extraordinary, where it can have a deep, deep impact. Thank you.
Yeah, in the middle here.
Hi, Javier Barrientos from Biogen. So a lot of talk about LGBT as workforce, but how about LGBT as LGBT-owned businesses? Is there anything happening in the global scale to prop up LGBT-owned businesses?
I've actually not seen. I mean, there's a lot of work, as we know, on SMEs and on microenterprise, but I've not actually seen any theme around the issue of LGBT businesses.
I can comment a little bit on that. That we've seen, I think the case that I would mention specifically is here in our own hemisphere, where we've seen gay and lesbian chambers of commerce stand up now in several places. Some of that with guidance and assistance from organizations here in the U.S. But what we've seen, I had a chance a few months ago to be in Buenos Aires and talk to the founders of the Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce there, who've been enormously successful. They were the first to really put the promotion of LGBT tourism on first the city of Buenos Aires's agenda, and then more largely on the Argentine National Tourism Board agenda. And the reason I think that's a really interesting model is that they haven't stopped there, that they are now interacting with gay and lesbian chambers of commerce in other places in Latin America. We have seen this innovation stand up recently in Colombia as well. And I think those kinds of structures can catch fire. And the reason I think that's important is these are local businesses. I think in so much of my own travels, we see global leadership being exhibited by multinational firms, and I think that's the tip of the spear in many cases. But where they can then engage local partners and get that conversation going, and some of those businesses are gay-owned, some are not. But I think that's a really interesting intersection.
I mean, I guess USAID has been pushing a bit more to do local procurement. Has that had any LGBT spin to it at all?
Well, we are working on promoting greater fairness, I think, in terms of that kind of resourcing, but we still have work to do. I'd say that's still a work in progress.
Another gentleman in the middle. Yeah.
George Walker, and I'm the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Memorial Sloan Kettering here in New York. My question is actually for Darren around philanthropic dollars. And you talked earlier about the touch or the impact of individual philanthropy and how that has changed the conversation here. How are you seeing that conversation change in terms of individual and foundation philanthropy external, and particularly in countries that aren't necessarily open to an LGBT or even a progressive agenda? Is there a growth of those foundations and that philanthropy happening as well?
Well, it's important to remember in much of the world there isn't a tradition of philanthropy as we know philanthropy writ large. So getting to the question of is there LGBT philanthropy, again, is a second order. The first thing we have to do is help to build a philanthropic community and a philanthropic ethic in much of the world where it's not necessarily believed culturally that if you're wealthy, you should set up a foundation or that you should give away 10% of your income. And so a lot of what we've been doing is working to seed and support indigenous philanthropy in places, particularly India and China. Latin America I think probably a decade ago, really came on board with a number of new foundations, many high net worth families. And in those countries, you are beginning to see small numbers of philanthropists supporting LGBT activity. But let's be real. I mean, in much of the world, philanthropy is conservative. And the idea, even in our own country, the imperative for philanthropy of Rockefeller and Carnegie was religious. And it's the same way in much of the world today. And so there isn't a great community. I think there's a huge potential, but we are far from realizing that. So
we're pretty much out of time. So I wanted to ask each of you to end with a couple of one-sentence answers. And to two questions. One is, what's the number one priority for multinational businesses as you see it over the next 12 months on this issue? And secondly, from your experience, any of the businesses that is here today saying, yeah, we want to do more in this area, one piece of advice you'd give them to help them do it well? And maybe Darren, you can start.
The one bit of advice is to listen.
And what's the number one priority for action over the next 12 months?
I think the number one priority has to be partnership, doing things locally that reflect authentic representation and authentic culture.
Randy?
I would dwell on the issue of leadership, ultimately, that I think, as businesses look at their global investments, that they understand the need to be able to utilize their talent, get the greatest productivity out of their staff, and understand that fundamentally inclusion is where that is at, is to share that more broadly in conversations with ministers of economic development, ministers of finance, when they're in some challenging environments. This is not a political statement. It's a statement of fact. And I think in any sector, whether that's government, business, or civil society, leadership matters. It matters fundamentally.
And a piece of advice as they do that? To how to avoid mistakes?
Well, I would say, I would echo Darren's guidance, and that is to make sure that our ears are as open as our mouths. That, I think one thing I've been struck by is in some of the most challenging places or most underdeveloped environments, there may be a willingness or a trend to sort of think that civil society doesn't know what they're doing. In fact, they do. They may be under-resourced. They may need structural or organizational training, a little bit of guidance on how to engage, but they know they know their environments. And I think to always be mindful of that so that we are first and foremost doing no harm. But doing no harm too frequently gets translated as don't do anything. And I think there's a fundamental difference there.
So we now move to a 30-minute refreshment break, but before we do so, I'd like to thank Randy and Darren for a superb discussion. Thank you.